So, I've got a really fascinating idea for you today. Can the phrase peace through strength actually be more than just a political slogan? We're going to dive into a thought-provoking article that imagines what would happen if we treated this concept like an engineering challenge, not a political football.
All right, think about this. What if a political slogan you've probably heard a million times, peace through strength, wasn't just a soundbite? What if we actually took it seriously as a starting point for global policy?
And that right there is where things get really interesting. The source material for this explainer imagines a world where leaders put their politics aside and approach this idea like a team of engineers. Their one and only challenge? To design a system that can actually deliver on that promise of peace through strength. So here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to follow their structure and run this whole idea through a series of pressure tests. First, we'll look at the core premise. Then we'll test it against economic, geopolitical, and finally domestic challenges to see if it actually holds up.
Okay, so where do you even begin? How do you turn a catchy phrase into a real, concrete plan for global stability? Let's dig into that core premise. The entire conversation in this thought experiment kicks off with this foundational argument from an imaginary speech. The basic idea is that weakness invites conflict, so building up national strength is really the most direct way to prevent war. Now, for the sake of the exercise, everyone at this imaginary roundtable agrees to take this intention, the pursuit of peace, at face value.
And this is the absolute key to the whole exercise. Instead of getting bogged down in the usual political fights, the roundtable uses an engineering approach. They ask the hard questions. Okay, what's the actual claim here? How is this supposed to work in the real world? What are the biggest risks? And maybe most importantly, what kind of guardrails do we need to build in to prevent a total disaster?
First up, the economic pressure test. If your economic power is the bedrock of peace, how in the world do you use a tool like tariffs without just kicking off a massive trade war? Let's see what the experts in our source material came up with.
And this is the first big hurdle they have to clear. They move way beyond the usual debates and ask, okay, if the ultimate goal here is stability, not just a better trade balance, then what is the strategic purpose of a tariff?
So the experts in this roundtable draw a really sharp line in the sand. On one side, you have the public rhetoric. Tariffs as a tool for fair trade. But on the other, they say there's a different, much more strategic goal, a kind of global shock therapy that's really designed to build up your own economic resilience and give you the leverage you need in negotiations. So how do you make sure you're using tariffs like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer? Well, the experts propose this exact set of design principles. It all starts with targeting very specific strategic choke points. Think advanced microchips or critical minerals, not just random goods. Then you have to pair that pressure with incentives for your own domestic industries. Coordinate with your allies so you're not going it alone. And this is crucial. You have to offer very clear, achievable ways for the other side to de-escalate.
All right, let's ramp up the pressure. For the next test, we're going to see how this framework holds up in the modern geopolitical landscape of AI, energy security, and of course, managing critical alliances.
The roundtable identifies this really fascinating and kind of chilling new threat, what they call a grid arms race. See, as AI's demand for power just explodes, nations are scrambling to build these enormous energy grids. But as these grids become the absolute lifeblood of modern economies, they also become incredibly tempting targets. And that creates a brand new and very dangerous flashpoint for conflict.
And this leads them to a super concrete example. The source material asks, why on earth does a place like Greenland suddenly become so important to global peace? Well, the answer is all about its geography. In an age of hypersonic weapons, its location is now absolutely vital for early warning systems and for controlling access to the Arctic.
But, and this is a huge but, just because a place is strategically important doesn't give you a blank check to do whatever you want. As the fictional Greenlandic politician Newt Gingrich reminds everyone, you just can't build a lasting peace on a foundation of coercion. Real security, he argues, has to come from the consent of the people whose lives are actually on the line.
So, to stop strength from just becoming provocation, the roundtable designs these geopolitical guardrails. First, the doctrine has to be crystal clear that it's for defense only, not for regime change. Second, any new security plans have to be integrated with existing alliances like NATO. Third, local partners have to give their consent and see real benefits. And finally, leaders have to show restraint and avoid rhetoric that just backs an adversary into a corner.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most important pressure test of all, the domestic one. Because as the roundtable argues, you can't really be a global power if your own house isn't in order. I mean, a nation that's fractured by division at home just doesn't have the resilience or the will to project stable strength out in the world.
So how do you build a more cohesive nation? The roundtable comes up with this three-part approach you see here: control, integration, and fairness. That means enforcing border laws to rebuild public trust, but also creating clear legal pathways for newcomers, and making sure the justice system is seen as fair for absolutely everyone. It's a really delicate balance, right? Control without integration can create alienation, but integration without control can destroy public trust. The argument here is that real national strength comes from mastering all three.
And this quote, it just perfectly nails the cultural goal of this whole framework. The objective isn't to create a society based on some kind of ethnic or racial purity, but instead to build a civic unity around shared laws, shared responsibilities, and shared institutions.
So, after putting this peace-through-strength idea through its paces, economically, geopolitically, and domestically, what's the final verdict? Can you actually turn a political slogan into a workable blueprint for a more stable world?
You know, if there's one single thing to take away from this whole exercise, it's the shift in perspective. By agreeing to accept a peace-first intention from the start, the conversation completely changes. It stops being a political fight over motives, and it becomes a practical engineering session focused on one thing: designing a system that is stable and resilient.
So what does the final blueprint actually look like? Well, it's not just about building a bigger army. It's a whole approach built on 4 key pillars. First, a strong and resilient nation at home. Second, a foreign policy that the rest of the world sees as legitimate. Third, a strong network of allies. And finally, and this one's so important, a constant commitment to diplomacy to avoid endless confrontation.
Which leaves us with this one last question to chew on. By applying these principles of design, with clear goals, specific mechanisms, and built-in guardrails, is it really possible to engineer strength for stability? Or is any massive buildup of power, no matter how well-intentioned it might be, always destined to just become a prelude to conflict? That's a question we're thinking about.